we are going to be talking about back to school, understanding the education system in Atlanta. What we're going to do is give a brief overview about CCI and who we are and what we do, and then we're going to dig right into the information. So get excited, and let's get started. So just to give a little bit of information on the Center for Civic Innovation before we start, we're an Atlanta-based organization that unites people who are fighting to end social and economic inequality in Atlanta. And as we know, social and economic inequality shows up in tons of numerous ways. And what we want to do is inspire people to take action, invest in ideas to help solve the issues of social and economic inequality, and advocate for policy change to be able to make solutions as well. So with this social studies program, what we want to do is highlight the importance of civic engagement in Atlanta, specifically as we better understand local government processes and how to get involved in decision making. As we mentioned, social and economic inequality is our North Star, if you will. And in the past, we've done programming on the budget, we've done programming on the census. And given that we are in back to school time, even though it might not feel that way with everything that's happening, we wanted to talk about back to school time and what that means and how social and economic inequality may show up in that way. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So for today, we are going to give a brief history of Atlanta Public Schools, as well as a snapshot of what APS looks like today. We're also going to be digging into how decisions are made and who is making those decisions. And as I mentioned, budget season just happened, so we're going to be talking about how money is spent within APS as well. And then we're going to transition into our super awesome panel discussion with some experts in the field, both on the Board of Education, with PTA, and within the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. But before we get there, if you filled out the poll, we're gonna just get to know you guys a little bit and see who our audience is. We asked a couple of questions about involvement. So Kyle, do you want to talk about what the results were?
Yeah, thanks, Asile, and thanks everybody for joining us and for taking our little pop quiz that we share with you as we got started. From the looks of it, we have quite a few people that live here in the city of Atlanta, and the rest of folks are a little further afield, but not too far. There are quite a few APS parents. Maybe you're taking this last little break before school gets started back to join with us, but we appreciate you being here with us. We have a member of a PTA and some other folks that have different connections that we didn't identify, as well as some people that have no connection to APS at all. So thanks for joining us to learn more about the educational system here in the city of Atlanta. It seems like most of you went to public school for elementary school and secondary school, although there were some private school attendees as well as charter school attendees, and we have a homeschooler in the audience as well. So thanks for joining us. Luckily, nobody seems to know everything about APS, so we're gonna have a great time learning some. Hopefully we'll be able to increase your knowledge from a little bit, a decent amount, or even those of you who have a lot of information we'll be able to share a little bit more about what we know about APS, and then we can have that discussion with our awesome panelists to hear more about what they know about the system and about public education across the state of Georgia. So let's go ahead and get started with a brief history of the Atlanta Public Schools, or the schools here in the city of Atlanta. So we've had public schools for quite a while, dating all the way back to 1868. There was a new constitution in the state of Georgia that called for public education, a free system of education for all children. It was just that next year that the city of Atlanta, that the city council established a school board to help implement public education here in the city of Atlanta. But as with anything with the government process, it took a little time to get up and running. So it was not until the next year that they were able to get authorization from the state to actually start classes and to construct buildings and do the other things necessarily to make the schools happen. And then it was in 1872, January of 1872, when classes started for the first time. As we were doing some research for this, this presentation, we learned that actually after the first day of school, they actually had to take a pause because it was winter, it was January, and the heat wasn't working. So they had to delay school, the official start of school of actual classes until the next week, until they could get the heaters working in the school. So those things happen today. So not surprising that they happened back in the 1870s as well. But just drawing your attention that that original 1868 Constitution did say that there would be free education for all children. But as we might suspect in the state of Georgia and in the South at that time, who that free education was going to and for which children were included in all children might be up for debate. And sure enough, we had a segregated school system across the state of Georgia. That 1878 or 1877 Constitution instituted a separate but equal series of schools. And that was also true in the city of Atlanta, that we had Black schools and we had white schools. And that was the pattern for a very, very, very long time. But let's go ahead and sort of get closer to the present, to where we are today, and learn about how we started to desegregate our schools in the city of Atlanta. So there were a series of court cases all the way up to Supreme Court that helped desegregate the schools in Atlanta. The first one, which maybe isn't as well known across the country, but was really impactful here in Atlanta, was a case led by the NAACP of a school teacher who wanted to make sure that the salary practices weren't discriminatory. At that time, Black teachers were paid less than white teachers, even though they were doing the exact same work teaching students, even though it was in a segregated system. So so Mr. Davis sued the school system, and it took quite a few years, but he was successful in getting that broken down so that white teachers and Black teachers had the same pay scale. The big decision that affected schools across the country was the Brown versus Board of Education decision from the Supreme Court in 1954, which ruled that those separate but equal schools were no longer allowed under the Constitution, and that we had to have racially integrated schools. But as with many things decided by the courts, there's always people trying to make other interpretations based upon it. So in the following year, the court ordered that you couldn't drag your feet, that you had to act with all deliberate speed to try to desegregate the schools. But as you can look down at the other dates here, we weren't quite done yet. There were still folks trying to figure out the process of desegregating schools and how that would play out across the country. So in 1958, there was the Cooper versus Aaron decision that said that this was a case that this local school board was still trying to desegregate, but there was much public opposition to it, and that was not grounds for not desegregating the schools. And then much later in the 1970s, there was a case in Charlotte, North Carolina, where a potential remedy to help integrate the schools was to allow for busing, and that was an appropriate way to help remedy the difference between the Black and white schools. And then in 1974, we finally had sort of the end of the desegregation or the integration era here in Atlanta, when a NAACP court case that dated all the way back to 1954 was finally decided and agreed upon by the U.S. District Court. We'll talk a little bit more about how that played out specifically here in Atlanta. So August 30th, 1961 was that first official day of desegregation here in the Atlanta public school system, where there were 9 high school students that were able to enter previously all white high schools. Now, there weren't just 4 Black students who were interested in attending those white high schools. There were quite a few. There were hundreds of students who were trying to get access to the previously white schools. But there were a series of admission tests based on personality as well as an intelligence test that were only given to Black students. And those tests were used as justification not to allow hundreds of other students to attend the white schools in the Atlanta system. And the original plan back in the early 1960s was to just take just a couple years at a time. So you'd start at the high school and work your way down. So it would be a generation before all of the schools would be desegregated, which was found not to be an appropriate way to act with all deliberate speed. So that was changed later on. But the real thing that impacted the desegregation or integration conversation here in Atlanta was actually a change in population, that there were quite a few parents of white students who decided to withdraw their students from their children from the APS system and move to outlying suburban counties and enroll their students or their kids in schools there. So this was the primary way that the Atlanta public school system was integrated, was by a white flight, by the removal of white students from the system that up until that point had roughly been 50-50 Black-white. The numbers drastically changed and dropped for the white students and drastically rose percentage-wise for the Black students who remained in the Atlanta public school system. Now that agreement that was signed in 1974 by the U.S. District Court was actually negotiated by the NAACP in 1973. And that required that a minimum of 30% enrollment in each of the schools be a Black enrollment, that busing would be allowed, that would be a way that we'd help accomplish desegregation in the city of Atlanta, that 50% of the administrative or central office staff positions would be for Black employees, and that for the first time, the Board of Education would have to appoint a Black superintendent. We already had a Black board chair of the Board of Education, Benjamin E. Mays, but this was the first time that we would have to have a Black superintendent lead the school system as well. So here is that first Black superintendent, Dr. Alonzo Krim, who became the first Black superintendent in 1973. This quote here from 1975 still seems fairly applicable today, that no matter how much we hope the schools could just be about education, they could just be about educating students and making sure that they are learning, that there's so many other things that the school system plays a role in, or has become a politically charged space. For those of you who are paying any attention to the news these days, you can see discussions about whether to be in class or to be virtual, to be hybrid, whether or not to wear a mask. All those things are highly sort of politicized conversations. And as we will discuss with our panel as well, that so many of these things that the school systems have to do now are trying to right these broader social wrongs that have nothing to do with the education of children, but trying to make sure that we have safe spaces for children to learn, but also just to participate in society. So we'll talk about that more with our panel in just a minute.
Thank you, Kyle. So now that we've talked about a brief history of APS, we're going to look at what APS looks like today and give you a little bit of a snapshot on what numbers are looking like and how APS is broken down. So to start with the state level, Georgia has 159 counties, which all have their own school district. Atlanta Public Schools is one of 21 city school districts in the state, and the other city school districts that are close to us are Decatur and Marietta. A fun fact, Fort Benning and Fort Stewart are part of the Department of Defense's Southeast District and have their own school systems as well. So that's something really interesting to think about. But Atlanta is one of 21 city school districts within the state. And kind of talking about, to Kyle's point, what racial segregation looks like now, here's a snapshot of how APS compares with other districts in terms of a racial breakdown. APS is the 6th largest district in the state based on student enrollment. And as you can see, some school districts, including APS, are still rather segregated racially. So thinking about that history and bringing it to today, this is a good snapshot to look like in comparison to the other school systems. And this is not an issue that we are alone in facing. Racial segregation definitely persists across the country. This is a map from the 2015-2016 school year that shows an uneven distribution of Black students and white students. And it's not unique to Metro Atlanta at all and still persists in school districts across the country, but of course is most prevalent in the Southeast, as you can see in this map. Just to give a further overview of APS specifically, APS has a variety of learning sites. The majority of schools are zone schools or traditional schools, and they're divided into clusters, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. But there are 58 zone schools with 19 charter schools and 6 partner schools that either partner with a charter program or a for-profit program or something like that, with 2 single-gender academies and 3 alternative programs. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about clusters a little bit more, but there are 9 school clusters with 1 high school, 1 to 2 middle schools, depending on the district, and 2 to 6 elementary schools. So this is a brief overview of APS and how those schools are broken out.
So the other thing we'll talk about in addition to the zoned or traditional schools are charter schools, but we also want to mention that APS is a charter system. And what's important to note about that is that charter is a contract. So for a charter system, the state of Georgia has a contract with APS that gives the Atlanta Public School System some additional autonomy, some additional flexibility on how it wants to operate the system. But likewise, there are some charter schools in the Atlanta system as well. The first charter school in the city of Atlanta was the Drew Charter School, which was opened in 2001. As we mentioned, there are 19 charter schools across the system now. And then it was in 2016 that the school system became a charter system. But what we want to make sure that everybody understands is that just because you have a charter system does not mean you have all charter schools. And there are plenty of schools across the state that are charter schools that aren't part of this charter system.
So with that, here's a further breakdown of the student population in the city of Atlanta. Roughly 88% of kids in the city are enrolled in a public school, and 79% of that 88% are enrolled in traditional schools. So that breakdown on the right side shows more of how that 88% is broken out. And there are about 30 private schools in the city of Atlanta.
So speaking again of the traditional schools or the zone schools, there are 9 attendance zones. And each of those zones, or what we call a cluster in APS, has 1 high school. And those boundaries do shift from time to time as the school age or student population does change. And we'll talk about that more in just a minute. But we want to make sure you know that these school zones do not align with school district boundaries, those district boundaries that we use for elections to elect our school board members, such as the school board member who's on our panel. And those school district boundaries are adjusted just once every 10 years based upon the census. So right now, if you haven't filled out your census, please go fill out your census and make sure we get an accurate count. But that adjustment of the school district boundaries, that will be done based upon the total population. So from age 0 up until however old people get these days, that is what that is adjusted based upon once every 10 years. Now, speaking of that adjustment, APS is currently in the process of conducting a facility master plan, the first time in about 10 years that they've done that. And they want to make sure that they're well prepared for the student population going forward, that they've got the right schools in the right locations, the right classroom sizes, the right others, the right number of teachers, all the right things to make sure that when kids are physically on a campus that they can be accommodated. And as you can see here, over the past 7 years from this chart, the latest data is from 2017, showing that change across the city. And you can see that in some of these clusters, some of these zones, there has been a significant increase in population of students, and in some areas there's been a decline in population. So we would encourage you to find out more about this. We have a link here, and we'll include this in the information we share after this presentation is over as well. But this is an ongoing process. It has been delayed a little bit because of the COVID crisis, but it's still ongoing. And if you want to have your voice heard or want to find out more information about this, please visit that website, atlantapublicschools.us/FMP for Facilities Master Plan.
Thank you so much, Kyle. So now that we've given you a snapshot on APS and the history of APS, we're going to get a little bit more specific and talk about who the decision makers are, who those people in power are, what they do. And what we want to do at CCI is equip you with that knowledge of who the breakdown of power is, so that way if you have a concern or if there's something you want to provide feedback on and get engaged with, you know who to go to. So the 3 main groups of people that we're going to be talking about are the Board of Education. As we mentioned, we have a Board of Education member on our panel today, the superintendent, and GO teams. Of course, there are tons of other people that keep APS running, but we're going to focus on these specific groups today. So we're going to start with the Board of Education. So the Board of Education establishes and approves policies that govern the school system overall. There are 9 total members of the Board of Education. 6 of them represent those geographical districts that we saw the map of, and 3 are at-large members for the entire school district. They're elected by the public for 4-year terms, similar to other elected officials, and they get to choose their own chair and vice chair for 2-year terms. The board also appoints the superintendent, which recently happened a couple of months ago, who is responsible for the day-to-day administration of the school district overall. In addition to that, the Board of Education determines the official zone boundaries for each elementary, middle, and high school. So these are some of the things that the Board of Education does. And now we're going to talk about the superintendent. So the superintendent overall creates and implements tons of educational systems operationally, financially, technologically, so on and so forth, for the long-term vision and long-term transformation of APS and overall student improvement. They also prepare and manage the budget, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, and they work with the Board of Education to pursue the goals of the strategic plan and provide meaningful leadership overall. We recently have a new superintendent, Dr. Lisa Herring, and she is the superintendent that as of May, I believe. So that's our superintendent currently. One other group of people that we really wanted to make sure that we mentioned were Go teams. So local school councils have been replaced with local school governance teams or Go teams, and now they have a more defined structure and decision-making authority on what happens. And these are pretty unique because they're broken down into a variety of different people within the Go teams. So there are 3 elected parents or guardians, there are 3 instructors, 3 teachers, 3 instructional staff. There are 2 appointed community members. There's 1 appointed student for high schools only, of course, and there's 1 appointed swing seat. And this is a very unique way to govern and to see how decisions are made because there are multiple different players with different perspectives at the table to be able to do those things. And each Go team is responsible for collaborating with the school leaders to provide input on the school strategic plan, budget, flexibility, and more. So it's a really awesome opportunity. And if you're interested in finding out more about Go teams, you can definitely check it out and see how you can be involved. I imagine now with current circumstances, being a parent or being an instructor, that feedback is going to be much appreciated. So Go teams are super unique. And if you're interested in something like that, that's awesome. It's definitely an awesome way to get involved. Here's a larger organizational chart. This is as of 2018, so some of the names are a little bit different. But as we mentioned, we talked about the Go team, superintendent, and board of education. But there are tons of other people that keep APS moving. So these are some of those positions as well. And just a note, we mentioned that Dr. Lisa Herring is the superintendent, so that's different from this chart, which was in 2018.
So for those of you who joined us for our previous social studies where we covered the local government budget, we're not going to go into all the detail of the APS budget again, but we do want to cover some highlights for those of you who weren't able to join us last time and make sure that you understand some of these sort of big issues regarding where money's coming from and where money's going as we talk about the Atlanta public school system. So first off, for tax owner or for property owners in the city of Atlanta, commercial property owners as well as residential property owners, roughly half of that tax collection goes to the Atlanta public school system. The other half is split fairly equally between the city of Atlanta and the county. So whether you're in Fulton County or DeKalb County, they get roughly a quarter. The city of Atlanta gets roughly a quarter, and APS gets about half of the property taxes that are collected in the city. Now, every time you go shopping, when you're out and about and hopefully socially distanced and wearing a mask, 1 cent of that sales tax goes to what's called the eSPLOST, or the Education Special Local Options Sales Tax. And that goes specifically to capital projects, to school buildings, construction, renovation, those major sort of purchases. That does not help pay for teachers. That does not help pay for other sort of day-to-day operations. That is only for the capital cost, the long-term cost of operating the school system. Now, there's a lot of different budgets. There's a lot of different sources of funding. We're going to talk just quickly about the general fund. That is the one that has the most flexibility, and there's the most ability for the public to comment and weigh in and have that adjusted from year to year, as well as for the school board to make considerations or changes on that as we sort of move forward. So the biggest piece of that is that general fund, $843 million for this current year. But there are some additional funds. We mentioned eSPLOST, which is that the money specifically for capital projects. You can see how that fits in as well. But most of the money that comes in is into the general fund. As we mentioned, it's $843 million roughly for this current fiscal year. And APS has around 52,000 students. So on a per student basis to cover all the costs associated with that student. So for the buildings, for the electricity, for the school buses, for the instructions, the textbooks, everything that sort of encompasses, it's around $16,000 per student per year. Now, where that money's coming from, we mentioned those local taxes. There is some money that comes in from state taxes as well. Lots of that's from your income tax, the portion of your income tax that you pay to the state. And there are some additional sources of funds as well from the federal government or from fund balance. So as you might suspect this year, the tax revenue is anticipated to be down. So in previous years, APS has saved some money for a rainy day, and they're able to tap into that money rather than raising taxes to try to balance the budget for this year. And now where's money being spent? The vast majority of money is being spent on instruction. So paying teachers to be able to have them teach students. As was mentioned, APS has some physical property that needs to be maintained. There are buses, there are other things that need to happen as well. So a portion of the budget does go to cover those expenses. as well as other things that aren't directly tied to in-classroom instruction. You have school counselors, you have physical education, you got other things that aren't happening in the classroom directly. And that's many of what the things that are under pupil services. And then you have central administrative staff, other folks that are trying to make the whole system work. You've got budgetary staff, you have IT staff. You'd imagine that's pretty important today, making sure students can connect online and the websites are working and all that stuff. So there's a lot of expenses, but overall, the vast majority of APS's budget is being spent on student instruction. Now, just a few highlights of the budget and sort of what we're having to deal with this year versus previous years. There was a plan to have new textbooks for students this year, but that has been delayed in order to decrease the cost for this current year because of decreased revenue and taxes. Schools are also being asked to tap into the rainy day funds just to make sure that we're not going to have to dip too far into other expenses. So that is another way we're trying to balance the budget this year. Overall, there have been a decrease in that per student allocation. Last year was more than $16,000 per student, but this year they brought it down to try to not spend too much money, although still trying to maintain the services and the education for the students. And then lots of the reductions have been in that central office staff, that central administrative staff, to make sure that as much money as possible can still be spent on educating the students. I believe some of the money has been cut back from some training and some other things that are very, very sort of nice things to have. We'd love to have, but wanting to make sure that this year that the students are fully being taken care of. So with that, we will start to move into the panel discussion.
Yay! Thank you so much, Kyle, for joining me on that presentation. I hope that was insightful information and a good foundation for the panel discussion that we're about to dive into. We have three super awesome panelists that have a wealth of knowledge on the education system and on APS and on state policy in general. So panelists, if you can take time to introduce yourselves for the audience that's here, we can go ahead and get started. So we will start with Ashay.
Hey, yes. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. I am Ishay Collins. I serve as Vice Chair of the Atlanta Board of Education, and I also represent District 6 on the board, which is pretty much the south side of Atlanta. Born and raised in Atlanta. I am from the East Atlanta area. Right at the border of Atlanta and DeKalb. And so I actually matriculated through high school to Druid Hills High School. But as a result of an M2M program, which that was in the 90s, sort of like it was actually a busing program. So interesting to hear how that history has circled back. Went to undergrad here, began my career in education as an elementary school teacher in Atlanta Public Schools, teaching at Ada Williams Elementary and Bond Homes, and knew that my fight was greater than my experience in the classroom. And so I stepped out the classroom and pursued ed policy, in which I sit before you today, advocating for high quality education for all children, no matter which zip code, income bracket, race, gender, family orientation, wherever. Just the fight that every child deserves a great education, and it looks different for everyone. So I'm excited to get more into this budget piece with you guys to understand the most of the overarching numbers that you're seeing. So thank you for having me.
Awesome. We're super excited to have you. And we think that we're going to dig into a little bit more how those past experiences have fostered your knowledge now. So we're excited to get into that. Richard, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Richard Corderone. I'm president of Atlanta Council of PTAs. Like Ishay, I am a multi-generational native of Atlanta and Metro Atlanta. My mom, though, is an immigrant, and my father is, I guess you could call an immigrant too, because he grew up in Boston. But I grew up in Clayton County, and in the 80s and 90s, at a time when there was a massive demographic shift happening there, and sort of seeing, growing up in that environment, seeing that Clayton County in many ways was just a stop on the White Flight Express, from East Point, College Park, Capeville, Forest Park, Morrow, on down now into Henry and Fayette counties. And I became involved in schools probably about 10 years ago, when a lot of people did during the massive redistricting after the cheating scandal, and about the time that my oldest entered school as well. And I saw massive inequities, massive segregation that still occurs within schools, and massive misunderstanding of how schools interconnected with communities and the role that schools play in supporting children and connecting to the communities. And for context, so I got involved at cluster level, at school level, and eventually now at the citywide PTA level. And so PTA is the largest child advocacy organization in the country. And we're a child advocacy organization. It happens that we are in schools because that's where a lot of kids are. And so it's a great place for us to really consolidate our work and reach and support kids and make sure that they're getting what they need. And I think that reflects a lot of what's happened in schools as well, where we've had this opportunity and this need to really kind of funnel social services and supports to kids and communities through the schools. And now we're seeing that, there's not redundancy necessarily. And so the other role that PTA plays as a child advocacy organization is really connecting and facilitating and encouraging and advocating for connections across government agencies, across nonprofits, across other groups, across community groups, to really kind of make sure that the whole community is lifting up our children. Sometimes that means bringing the communities into the schools, and sometimes that means bringing the schools and the services into the community. And so we've not only been active in recent years related to educational advocacy, but we've also worked on issues related to making sure that children are safe in the communities, whether they're walking or biking, and have partnerships with groups like the Atlanta Bicycle Coalition and PEDS and others to ensure those kinds of things. And when we do trainings for PTAs in communities, we really focus heavily on this piece of the PTA being the bridge between the school and the community, and supporting that. So I'm excited to be here today and talk about all those things and come up with great ideas and hopefully trigger some other people to action.
Awesome. Yeah, we're trying to inspire people for action as well. So thank you so much for that, Richard. And last but not least, Stephen, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Absolutely. My name is Dr. Stephen Owens, and I am the Senior Education Policy Analyst at the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit advocacy organization that works to expand economic opportunities so that all Georgians can thrive. And I work a lot, especially on state education funding as a way of understanding what are the priorities of the state of Georgia. Grew up in Clayton County and Fayette County as well, went to public schools there, got my doctorate from the University of Georgia, and now live in town Atlanta, and my son's gonna start at M. Agnes in 2 weeks. So
Wow.
excited to be an APS parent. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Stephen. Since our presentation wasn't exhaustive, we weren't able to talk as much about the role that the state plays in our local school system. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of pre-COVID scenario, and it's more typical year, if there is such a thing, the role that the state or the federal government plays and what happens in our local school systems in the Atlanta metro area?
Absolutely. So the constitutional responsibility for public education sits at the state level. And the fact that property taxes make up the majority of APS's budget doesn't take away from the fact that it's the responsibility of the state to make sure there's an adequate public education for every single student. And I bring that up because it doesn't say adequate public education unless broadband internet is expensive. It doesn't say adequate unless transportation is too difficult. That's a constitutional responsibility. And so as we see inequities in how funding goes to school districts across the state, We can't just say like, oh, that's too bad they don't have, strong property tax base like APS or like Forsyth County. That is the responsibility of the state. And so when we see things like what happened this year, that the state passed a budget that had a $1 billion cut to public education funding. And the vast majority of that is pushed down to local districts. I think APS, because of its strong property tax base, is only going to take about a $19 million hit from that. Even still, even kind of in this, as we look at these COVID days and we see that we have decreased revenues, it's still the responsibility of the state to provide that requirement of a good, adequate public education. And so one of the things that we advocated for this year, and we're able to get a lot of good conversation even as we didn't get bills passed, was expanding revenues in Georgia so that all school systems can benefit from that we can then pass additional funding to all the students in the state of Georgia. And one way we kind of advocate for that is the fact that Georgia is one of only 8 states that doesn't have additional funding specifically for kids living in poverty. Something that if we did, and if we kind of entered into the 21st century like 42 other states, that would absolutely do right by the city of Atlanta because of the amount of concentrated poverty we have here in the city. So yeah, that's what it looks like. It was a very strange General Assembly, but even though all APS has the ability to raise funds on the local level, when we see differences in funding, that's a state issue. And that's something that the state has to address. The fact that we rely so much on property taxes, that is a relic from the 1800s that honestly needs to be called into account in the future.
Thanks, Stephen. Maybe we should have sent our poll to members of the General Assembly to see how much they know about our school system and to find out what year it is if they've recognized they were in the 21st century. No, thanks for that information. Ashay, I would like to ask you quickly, since Stephen mentioned some of the sort of special programs and making sure that we're taking care of all students, not just maybe a select few group of students that have access to schools or to technology. Can you tell us a little bit how, even prior to this current budget, what APS was doing at the end of last school year when COVID hit to make sure that students had access to the resources they needed to continue learning?
Yes. So just to quickly answer your question, because I think it's a larger response than that. When COVID hit, of course, as you can imagine, all of the inequities that we knew existed and that I know for many of us have been fighting and trying to at least make sure is addressed and put on the forefront, whether it's funding, support, capacity, et cetera. When COVID happened, that exacerbated it, and everyone now became aware of the deep inequities in regards to access, just access to basic services, access to nutrition, access to support, technology, support for our most struggling families. And so the map that you show, where you see this huge influx of population and particularly the west side and the south side of this city, where it's such a high rate of poverty, what we had to do, we definitely made sure that we supported those families and hit the ground running to provide those services. And so that was, in fact, partnering and the district not only doing its job, but partnering with others to make sure families had food. There was basic services. We pulled technology out of the schools to make sure our children, as much as possible, had access to their, technology, because reality was that, there were families where I know for a fact there was a situation, I use as an example. I got a call from a family, a parent needing, needing tablets and computer, needed technology for her 3 children, because they were all literally trying to access the content of what they need, of online instruction from her phone. And so, just that basic need of making sure that all of our families and children have access to the technology was key. And then, of course, providing the Wi-Fi access. So we, in fact, partner with, and I use an example with Comcast to at least help us raise funds to provide the connectivity access to hit another hurdle on certain parts of town where the infrastructure, they're completely dropped, dead zones. So so of course, school system, again, thinking about ways of how can we support those families to ensure that that they even had access to adequate connectivity for children to access instruction at that time. A lot of what we were doing, and a lot of, I know everyone has seen, was the fact of making sure that families had that our families had basic needs. Many of our students, breakfast and lunch, or breakfast and lunch were their only meal, and so it was very important for us to get down to the source of supporting our families to that level. But before that, even before COVID hit, what Atlanta was doing, I know there was a slide that you talked about where you broke down the budget and said that there was a pupil dollar, a dollar per pupil that we were spending for the last 6. I've been in the board for 7 years. The last 6 years, we have engaged on student-based funding, which is completely different than what we did in the past. Another, and what in the past, what will be deemed another antiquated way of funding, where you took the big bucket of money, you divided it evenly amongst a number of students, and every child got the same, every school based on their population, each child got that same dollar amount. Well, we actually flipped that on its head, and actually are funding our schools and funding based on student needs. So if there are schools that have a higher population of students with special needs, a higher population with students poverty, high population with students that are ELL, English language learners, and need additional support services, we are now moving those dollars to fund those schools and fund those communities at a different level than what we've done in the past. Has it been controversial? Absolutely, because of, as you get to the source of our funds, to Stephen's point in regards to property taxes and where they come from, in certain areas where more dollars are driven from a property tax base, it has pushed this conversation of equity versus equality. And that is one that we've had to have a lot of conversation about, the necessity for APS to now fully move to a district focusing on equity and not equality, which has been a tough conversation to have in certain areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what you're touching on about these issues existing with COVID, of course, but also year round. And I think that now, if I had a dollar for every time we talked about how unprecedented these times are, but they're true, it's true, and I think that although these are new challenges that we're starting to see, these are some of the challenges that have existed year round in particular communities. And that's something that we're looking to solve and see, hopefully, with these times, how can we fix that? And Richard, I know that you definitely have another public health hat in addition to your PTA hat. So what do you see the role of PTAs being here, and what challenges have you faced in general, but particularly during these times, given your public health lens as well?
Yeah, so I'll give a little bit of background for all the other people on who may not know me. I have worked in public health and emergency preparedness for 20 years. The issues on pandemic planning and pandemic preparedness are something that I've very rare among most people. I've actually been thinking about for most of my career. And so, the challenges of, and one of the things that I think we all saw when COVID hit was this lack of connection between the school system and other parts of government. Fulton County, the Atlanta Fulton County Emergency Management Agency has a huge emergency operations center. GEMA has a big emergency operations center. Public health is part of that operations center, and schools are part of that operations center sometimes. Schools are part of that emergency planning sometimes, and I think that's reflective of some of the other challenges that we have where we don't have these relationships in place. And this is not oh my gosh, this is a big problem. This is an easy solution. We have a new superintendent. We have an opportunity for the superintendent and the mayor's staff and the county commission and the county operations center and all of these groups to be talking to each other in areas where they haven't talked to each other before. We, as the school system, know the children. We know the children in the community. We know the problems in the community because we see them every day in our schools. This is the opportunity to start having those conversations. And a very practical part of that conversation, and something that is in the news right now that we can really talk about, is the situation where children are selling water on the side of the road. You know, many of those children have been matriculating through APS. They're high school age now, so they've been at APS elementary and middle school. We know them. We know those children. We know those communities. The principals can be involved practically in ways. The social workers at schools can be involved in practical ways in working with them. And the mayor and the superintendent should start having conversations around this. And there should be, if there aren't, there should be people on the committee and on the panel that are helping work through ways to support these kids and support these communities. APS people should be there because we know the kids, and really kind of working through and finding those solutions. And one of the things that we found, and one of the things that I think you guys do at CCI and really kind of push for, is making our city work well together, right? APS and school systems work, we have them separate because we don't want to politicize what they do. We want educators and experts involved in really supporting our children and knowing what to do with them. But they've got to talk and work across government, across business, across every aspect of the community, because everything is connected. And so I think that's, what in my mind has been the stark observation and the stark takeaway from it. And when we at Atlanta Council of PTAs worked on a recommendation for how we started school this year. And we started looking at that in May and June, and we're already thinking, based on what we saw happening with behavior, that we probably will go virtual in the fall. And started kind of putting that together and started talking to communities and understanding fears. And APS was doing something at the same time, and we were able to take some of their information as well. And that we recommended, as part of that recommendation, we've got to work and build these stronger social services in the community. DFACS in Fulton County has to work well with APS so that we can have extensions to reach and support these kids who are not logging on every day, and understanding that we need, and I've heard at the state level they're talking about this as well, this training for teachers to be able to understand and spot abuse, because child abuse reporting has gone down because one of the primary reporters are teachers, are people in schools, because they see the kids every day and they know when the situation has changed. So being able to train and prepare our teachers for what that looks like when you're going into the child's home via Zoom or via some other kind of instructional material is really important. So we've got to really kind of take almost this emergency management process where we have everybody in the same room talking to each other, working together for the same goal, and do that around kids. And I think it starts with some phone calls, some relationships. And from what I've seen going forward and starting with what our new superintendent is doing, is really kind of starting that process. But with everything in a pandemic and in a crisis, that process has to be accelerated. So I am hopeful that APS is doing that. And then I'll even kind of flip and sort of maybe take one of your roles, but I'm interested to know what APS has learned and changes in the system from what happened in the spring, which I think was an amazing lift with a very short turnaround so that we can implement something better in the fall. And I know that you guys have done work. I'm really I want to give you guys an opportunity to talk about it, is really kind of what I want.
Yeah, I think we definitely want to get to that as well. One quick question for Stephen. Since Richard, you've been mentioning sort of partnerships and the role that everybody can sort of play in working together. Just curious, because we in spite of the sort of desire to work together, as you sort of commented in the chat, that maybe there are certain things that the state really has responsibility for. But as we have seen in the news, both sort of pre-COVID, but definitely now as well, that the governor that we have is campaigned on local control. And we are definitely sort of seeing some of the ramifications of his willingness to sort of implement that, where we have different school systems doing different things, and there's not necessarily a clear sort of unified plan for how we might all be prepared to take collective action together. Can you help us sort of better understand, maybe what clearly is in the state's lane, what's clearly maybe in a local district lane, and where there might be some ability to bring in some other partners, or where you'd really sort of step on somebody else's toes if you tried to go beyond what the bounds of what you were trying to do, as maybe we've seen with the mayor of the city of Atlanta trying to mandate masks or strongly suggest masks. Sort of what role does the state clearly sort of have under its control, and what things are at the local level, and where there's sort of lines blurred, knowing that you're not an attorney and that these things can often get litigated in court, but just sort of how things have played out, at least in the past, or the discussions about where there might be some more leniency, particularly in a pandemic scenario, as to how we can try to address the needs of children, whether or not they're on campus or in a school setting or not.
Yeah, that's a great question. And saying that I'm not an attorney, I bet my comms director is watching this right now and stressed out about what I'm going to say next. No, I think Richard's point is very well taken, that we're seeing the places, the ways that our society and different organizations and goals for children intersect in the schoolhouse. And his point about defects is really fascinating, because even before COVID, we were at year 11 of the greatest expansion in economic history. And the General Assembly was proposing cuts to defects even before we had this pandemic. That I'd had conversations with a worker at defects who said that she had 400 cases on her docket. These are individual children. Like, that means you couldn't contact one of those kids, spend one child a day in a normal year. That we were having large cuts to the social safety net even before these unprecedented times. And you talk to teachers, and you talk to workers inside the school, and they will be the first to tell you that they cannot be the only pillar holding up the community. They cannot be the only thing that makes sure that a child is safe, that makes sure that a child is well fed. It is great that we have 1-2 healthy meals a day provided while you're in school, but that cannot be the way that you feed a community during a pandemic. And the way that you check on the health of a child can't only rely on teachers being able to notice these things, while also dealing with the skills acquisition, social emotional learning that we are asking our teachers and administrators to notice and work on. One of the things we found out, we do a yearly survey where we survey superintendents and district leaders on state action. And we are surprised at even wealthy districts how much that they'll charge Medicaid expenses to the state's Medicaid program, that how much they partner with our Medicaid. And if you asked me kind of what is the next, if we could do, reading intervention in every single classroom in the state of Georgia, or expand Medicaid, I would say expand Medicaid every single time. And I work, my life depends on analyzing education policy. And so we're seeing now just all the masters that our schools have to serve. And some of those times we really do need to look at state. When we look at funding, even as we have these dips in local funding, we need to recognize that that's a state issue. We need to recognize that a lot of the ways that we look at the social safety net, that absolutely implicates state lawmakers even before COVID. But there are great public-private partnerships, some of which that were already mentioned by Ms. Collins, of partnering with organizations to make sure that we have better broadband, hotspots, that we can do work and get devices in the homes of every single student. That there are ways. I mean, if you go to any school and that has an active PTA, especially those schools with like strong foundations, you're able to see a lot of gaps that are able to be covered. Maybe it's just in the infrastructure in the school, making sure that the sidewalks are in great repair. It could be as a necessary lever of accountability, making sure that administrative posts are being used, that our dollars are being used well. And one of the ways that I just want to give a shout out to APS in this regard, that we don't require, or haven't for a long time, required line items at the individual school level of budgeting. And you're going to say, Stephen, all you care about is the budget. I live in that crazy world that if you care about something, you got to pay for it. APS absolutely does show the budgeting down to the school level, and did that even before federal law required it in these past few years, has helped our parents and local communities see, okay, what are some of these gaps that need to be filled? Is this money being spent equitably? And I think that does allow for a lot of opportunities where if you see something that isn't carried on by kind of the state and the safety net, where you could work as a PTA, as a community with public-private partnerships to fill some of those gaps. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of to your point, the importance of those partnerships and like what we see sometimes is that the school system is that one catch-all service for everything related to a child, from mental health to food to after school care to everything around under the sun, and one of the things that I'm personally interested in, I guess, kind of to the point of the importance of partnerships and what role partnerships can take. Ishay, particularly in your past roles, I know that you have worked with Jumpstart in the past, and as a fellow Atlanta native, just wanted to shout that out too. Those partnerships are so important, and I know as someone in the nonprofit sector, we rely on partners all the time to be able to get our work done, because we're trying to move mountains a lot of the times that we can't necessarily do ourselves. And if we do, maybe something falls out through the cracks, or maybe a child gets left behind, or whatever the case may be. So what have you seen the role of partnerships playing in your work now? And how do you see that, I guess, changing or shifting during these times?
So just listening to everyone, I think, and probably the attendees on this call, and you could have it as many conversations. We all know what we know what the issues are. And partnerships. I mean, we all know the education system, we're taking on a lot. And to your point, like being the catch-all of everything, and our partners are so much, because of the fact there are certain things that partners do that they can actually take off our plate and collectively work with us to move things forward. So Richard's point, Stephen's point, your point, it all matters, and those conversations are happening, but what is the actual actions that are happening? And and is sometimes it goes beyond just dropping the money, but for me, it's the sustainability piece. We have some partners that have been doing this work with APS for years, and we're seeing, and they get it, we're seeing that this is not an immediate impact, immediate response, but collectively over time, we're chipping away of some systemic generational issues that are happening. And I think that's what it boils down to, is the fact that we cannot continue to water down and remove ourselves from the conversation that the situation that we're in now in the education space goes beyond the classroom. We are talking about family issues, community issues, opportunity issues. As you talk about the water boys, many that I know, because I represent that area, and having a conversation with them is one of is an economic conversation for them, an opportunity where they are in fact providing for their families. So while I'm trying to push them to make sure that they get that they're in classrooms and they have access to what they need to get the education that they need, as my role as a board member, as a former educator in Atlanta, we're constantly thinking about, okay, what's the next level of making sure your family have support? What is the traumatic, the generational trauma, the well-being that needs to be supported for your parents? What does that look like generationally? How about your community and where you live? What services and accesses that you don't have? And so, of course, for me as elected official, I definitely have connected and built relationships with other elected officials from city council, city council, state reps, Fulton County, our commissioners, for them also to be a part of this to help me address it. Is it hard? Has it been a tough fight sometimes? Absolutely. Has it been easy fixes? Absolutely. But it has been more of the fact of a systemic commitment to continue to chip away at these issues versus let me drop money here, let me bring light to this issue and then pull back. And I think that sometimes partnerships have been amazing with APS and the ones that we have, because they get it and they understand that this is not a 1 year, 1 semester, because we're, COVID right now, commitment, but this is a long-term sustainable, this is a long-term commitment that, we need your help. We need your help and commitment to make sure that we're closing closing the largest wealth gap in this country. And so, as I hear everything, we cannot, we cannot forget and we cannot dismiss the larger issue that is happening here. And it is one that is so much large, that is so huge beyond the classroom and the education space, that all hands are on deck. I mean, at every single level. So our partnerships have been amazing. Can we do more? Absolutely. What does that look like differently now? What would that look like in the current state that we're in now? Is very much different. To Richard's point, I think your initial question in regards to what is APS doing is having those conversations with talks at a city. Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's one thing we're really excited with Dr. Herring, the new superintendent, being on board. She and Mayor Bottoms are already having those cross communication and cross collaboration conversations about just pushing the services and access that both entities can provide, to at least pull some of that responsibility from the schools and from APS. In regards to the DFACS piece, I definitely want to put that out there. While I understand that is something that we're all looking at, we cannot, you guys, let's just have a real conversation about this. You cannot expect to go into certain communities of color and with just the label of DFACS and expect this open arm response as an agency that has in fact been that big brother policing agent for families. And so I'll be curious and interested to see what that partnership, and learn more as those conversations are happening. What does that look like to be able to support those families in a different way versus a more of a monitoring policing structure that it has often been used, in the recent past and historically, as particularly in certain communities.
I know that's obviously a major conversation, not just in APS, but APS, did take a fairly unique step a few years back to no longer work with the Atlanta Police Department, but to have its own school resource officers. So that is something that is obviously APS is trying to make sure that the typical police response isn't necessarily the one that's appropriate in that schoolroom setting. So Richard, since we have been talking a lot about partnerships, and in our presentation we didn't go in depth into the sort of long-standing partnerships that the PTA has, and the ways that y'all are able to advocate for the students, but also for teachers, and to have those conversations. Can you tell us a little bit more about the role that the PTA plays in the Atlanta system in particular, and how, not that everything has to be about COVID, but just sort of understanding with these issues that have maybe been heightened, right? That with access to food, and, as we talked about partnerships as well, that, typically during a summer, the city of Atlanta, through its recreation centers, offers, food to school children who are in their summer programs, but all those summer programs weren't happening, and there had to be some sort of quick decisions made. But maybe there might be some opportunity, as we've already been discussing about, maybe we start to shift the balance of where some of these things are taking place. Just tell us a little bit more about the role of the PTA and the conversations that you've been having sort of leading up through this upcoming school year, to figure out how we're going to adjust to what the new normal, if you will, is going to be.
Mm.
Sure. I'll start with just kind of, first of all, PTA is membership driven. And so what that means is that we don't depend entirely on donations from other groups. We don't depend on government support. And the member is at the center of what drives our initiatives and our policy. And the members are parents, teachers, community members. And the, you know, oftentimes, and where we plug in, and one of the individuals who helped write the charter for APS deliberately saw PTA as an advocacy point within the school to be able to connect to the Go team, the principal, the teachers, and the administrative piece. So it's built in within the system as an advocacy group, not necessarily as a fundraising group. And so PTA is unique in that we are member driven, we are not fundraising driven, but we do play a role in helping draw light on issues within the school, issues within the community, and helping engage and connect our members with those things. In addition to that, because we are a multi-level organization, we start at the student, the member, the school, or we call the local unit, the council, which is the level that I'm at, the district, which we're in District 10, so that covers all of Fulton County and APS, state and national levels as well. And so we participate and advocate at the state level for budgetary items. We advocate at the state level for child advocacy related issues that affect APS and have opportunities to partner there. But we also within a school, and we speak for parents and we speak for teachers. And I think in Georgia in particular, that voice of teachers and educators is something that at least we as a council, and I think we as PTA in general, think put a lot of emphasis on, because we're not a teacher unionized state. And so there's not always a good collective opportunity for a good collective voice for teachers and for educators to really kind of talk overall about things that are happening in the classroom. So we help educate our members to bring up issues and have the right conversations in the right context with things that are going on, right? So showing up at a board meeting when you're upset and yelling at you guys, Ishay, sometimes is effective, right? Sometimes you need to do that because there's an issue that you don't know about. But really a lot of advocacy happens built over time with long-term relationships. And that's where PTA connects with the teachers in the school, having that open space where teachers and parents are in the same space and they view each other as colleagues and people on the same team. Teaching and helping parents ask questions of their teachers about their child and about children in the classroom. So one of my children has dyslexia, and it was not diagnosed early, and he's a high functioning dyslexic, so he's incredibly bright. I have dyslexia as well, so it was not something that we were surprised about. And it was this conversation about identifying these things within children and asking and having conversations with our teachers about it, and what that looks like, and having that and just building that relationship. And I've gone into classrooms where teachers are often taught or have had the experience that there is a confrontation between the parent and the teacher, and we are on the same team. And so building that trust as a parent with the teacher took some time, but overall it's become really positive. And so understanding that and having that openness and creating that openness within the school is an important cultural thing that PTAs do within schools. And so you see some of the biggest challenges in schools that are struggling to build active PTAs or active parent-teacher organizations. And just like a lot of other areas, we focus a lot of our energy in schools in South and Southwest Atlanta. And we, as 501c3s, as PTAs are, we provide a structure for almost a turnkey solution and support and mechanisms to help parents become advocates in their communities. So when Stephen said he's going to be a parent at Jones, we really want him to be involved in the school because he has an understanding of it and is a community member and can connect. So anyone who is on this call, join your PTAs. Join as many PTAs as you can. I recommend oftentimes for community members and people who are active in MPUs and neighborhood organizations to join the PTA at their elementary, middle, and high school level when those opportunities are there, because that gives you that opportunity, that in to bridge between the community and the school. And so that when I'll bring it sort of back to COVID and sort of to some other things. This system that we have where everything is going through the schools is not resilient. The bottom line, we do not have a resilient city. And resiliency often means redundancy. And so when we are looking at budgets, redundancy is something that we often want to cut because it doesn't look efficient, but it is often absolutely necessary for an emergency and to get through an emergency. And not only did we not have redundant systems, we just didn't have the systems in place to support the kids in the communities. And so we knew that. We are working on that. Everyone here, I think, is working on that. And it does start with those identifying those gaps. And to Stephen's point, I really appreciated him as somebody who looks at education budgets, understanding that that stability in the community is incredibly important, and thinking about Medicaid expansion, because healthcare, one of the challenges of COVID that it's drawing to light is that, sometimes people may be sick and they're afraid of seeking medical care because it could be an issue of bills, it could be an issue of losing your job and eventually losing their home, and that cuts out the stability for the child. And so it is incredibly important. And everything that we're doing and we're talking about, I think we can look really geographically, and we can look and I know Mayor Bottoms is a Douglas graduate. And the communities around the Douglas cluster are struggling. And in particular, that is a part of the city where our elected officials and our tax dollars can go, and we can really see major benefits across the city by lifting up those communities. We will see that in the schools. We will see improved test scores in the schools. And test scores are really, in my mind, they're great for a lot of things, but they are an indicator of wealth and stability in a community in more ways than they are often a measure of educational attainment, the way that we do standardized tests in Georgia and in the United States. So our work and our partnerships, and this is, I know I am harping on this, but it is absolutely critical that we have our city and our county and our school system working together. Effectively, they share the tax base. And so we should have that expectation that happens. And, in terms of COVID and in terms of teachers, that was our big primary thing, is that we knew that teachers and adults in the building may not be safe. And I think that's a lot of what APS looked at as well. Regardless of whether or not we could say with some certainty that disease spreads well or doesn't spread well among children, we know that there are teachers, administrators, janitors, substitute teachers, parents who would all be affected by it. And so when we look at advocating, we look at the whole thing. And I always encourage all of our elected officials, all of our appointed officials, all of our government officials to see that as well. And Stephen bringing up Medicaid expansion is a great reflection of that. And, you know, that's something I would love to talk to Stephen offline about, how we as PTA can kind of get involved in some of those conversations as well.
Great. I would like to talk to Stephen online with a question. Do want to get to some of the Q&A that's come through our little panel. And since we've been talking about the tax base, since we've been talking about sort of these choices we make, and maybe at the state level, we have not valued redundancy if we were going ahead and sort of dictating some cuts pre this sort of current economic cycle. We do have a question from the chat regarding, you know, how we could get that extra money that other states seem to be providing for education. Where are other states getting money for education, and where's that coming from? Is it coming from property taxes, from income taxes? How are they able to pay to make more investments in their public education elsewhere across the country?
I mean, the amount of money that we take in per citizen in the state of Georgia, I think, is one of the lowest in the United States. And we're actually spending less money from the state of Georgia per person right before COVID since 2008. So we're lowering the amount of funding that is going to individual people. And it's like you put this on a tee. This is perfect. One of the things we advocate for is a cigarette tax, is that we have the second lowest in the nation. Good on us. Cheap cigarettes. Let's raise it to the national average. That's $600 million that shows up tomorrow. Also discourages smoking. And then when we're no longer getting that tax money anymore, now we just have a healthier electorate. That's a win-win. We could close the double deduction. We could expand Medicaid. The federal government pays 90 cents on every dollar for Medicaid costs. We are refusing. It's more like we're doing things like subsidizing smoking than actually providing services for the people of the state of Georgia. So there's a lot of options. You can go to gbpi.org and see our list of revenue options. I mean, the state of Georgia passed a tax cut 2 years ago that erased $1 billion from the revenues that we take in every day. So that is we are feeling that today. And the legislature was considering another tax cut before COVID hit. So this is, I know that we want to see that it is very hard to see the amount of taxes that we pay for the state of Georgia, but we're seeing now the essential services that we rely upon in order to provide stability for those communities. I love that phrase. And so there are a lot of those options, but I mean, the cigarette tax is a no-brainer. Closing the double deduction that only a few other states allow, that really only goes to earners that are in the $200,000 per year mark. I mean, these are easy, common sense ways we could raise revenues to do right by Georgians and do things like what we're calling an opportunity weight for students living in poverty.
Yeah, thank you for that. We've worked with GPPI in the past, and I've heard that be proclaimed from the mountaintops on multiple occasions. So that's definitely a solution that, who knows, maybe we'll see, given the times now, anything can happen, right? One other question, just to pull in from the chat really quickly, is for Ishay, and it's about what the conversation is around redrawing school boundaries, given the conversation that we're talking about with equity and with, you know, what resources are spread, maybe within the school system a little bit differently depending on the school cluster. What conversations are happening around redrawing zone boundaries, and what does that look like for you guys?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Again, another controversial question because, and to Richard's point, you know, 10 years ago when the district embarked on the redistricting process, it really was not done in true fidelity. From my understanding, this was before this board was even, elected, that they were literally drawing the lines during the meeting. So that's why this board, if we're going to have the conversation about what true redistricting for the district looked like, that's why we embarked on the facilities master planning. The last facilities master planning actually was done 18 years ago. Redistricting, so you're saying that, so think about, we did the district at that time was embarking on a redistricting plan without even an updated facilities master plan. So this board, we wanted to make sure that we knew we had all data. We explored our facilities, our properties, the growth, projected growth that is happening in the city before we actually embarked on a realistic, authentic conversation about redistricting, which is going to be a tough one, as it always is. Based on the charts that the data and the charts that you guys are providing, you see where there's bustling growth in areas across the city, and then there's stagnant in other areas. Part of the area that I represent is one of the ones where we've seen we're starting now to see growth, but at the beginning when I was first elected, we were stagnant, stagnant in growth. You hear about this projected number that it's going to be close to 1 million people that move to Atlanta by, I think, by 2040, and so what those numbers look like and the impact it'll have on our schools is going to require us to redistrict because of capacity. Capacity. We have this conversation often, it's brought to the table often, and then you hear, we receive very strong community feedback on the need to redistrict and the need not to redistrict. And it actually, to be fully transparent, authentic with you guys, it comes from a conversation of community dynamics, demographics, to me, underlining thoughts and perception on, still segregation, keeping communities as they are. I often push back on this conversation of, well, let's have the real conversation about, is it one of, I don't want my kids or my community mixed with these children and from this community, and what does that actually mean when what does that actually mean when you say that? So the facilities master plan, to answer your question, the facilities master planning piece is a step for us to prepare to begin those conversations on what redistricting, what the possibilities of what redistricting may, will look like, and what we may have to do in the near future. So get ready for it. It's going to be, it's going to be a tough one, but necessary, as this work is.
Yeah, no, it is tough. And we've had some questions come up in the Q&A we've obviously been talking about as well, about these real systemic challenges. And that's one of the reasons why, through our intro presentation, we wanted to go back, to the earliest days of APS, and that some of these things were built into the system. Maybe they later sort of got amended out, at least de jure, sort of from the law, but they're still de facto. They still exist in these systems. So I think to that point, just sort of curious how some of these partnerships that we might work together, just sort of thinking out loud, but as we're thinking that maybe some of these schools are declining in student population, like what role could the broader community, could Invest Atlanta, the city of Atlanta, other partners, nonprofits play to help support those communities, so we're not having these such drastic transitions in population, and then people are concerned about, my students now going to have to go across the city to a new school because we're shutting potentially one down or shifting those boundaries so much. What do y'all see as ways to help address some of those issues that are clearly sort of outside the campus of the school, but have such an impact on these decisions? We know from the conversations, the work we've been doing with the NPUs and our neighborhood planning initiative, that when a rezoning comes in, one of the things that the applicant has to state is the number of units they might be including in that project, and the breakout of, is it 1 bedrooms, is it 2 bedrooms or 3 bedrooms, and what impact that might have on the schools, to figure out these sort of demographics and what the trends might be. But what are y'all currently doing, or what might you see as sort of new or different ways to help to address those issues, so we maybe don't have such controversy as we continue to give the haves more and are starting to continue to sort of withdraw from those that haven't had those resources over time?
Yeah, so I'll start. You actually started immediately what I was going to say: affordability. As we, one is starting with affordability. When I look at the changes that are happening, a lot of families are being pushed out. There's 2 things that's happening. A lot of families are being pushed out because of lack of affordability. The increased rent, purchasing here and that, home values, in Atlanta is increasing, where there's this push out of families. Most of those families are families that that we want in APS to take advantage of all the services, the social emotional, everything that we're offering. So there's this push out. Then also what I am seeing, as I am also, and I am also one of those people. I bought in a community, I bought in a community where, I had this conversation with my neighbors where majority of the, 80% of their children go to other schools. Whether it's private school or they're choosing, whether it's private school, whether they're choosing charter or they're choosing a homeschool. So for me, I've become a brand ambassador for Atlanta Public Schools and constantly pushing and selling what our clusters, and I represent the Thorough cluster and the South Atlanta cluster, what we're offering and what our taxpayer dollars are paying for, and that your child can have that same experience, and with you not having to pay the additional $25,000 to $30,000 a year. But there is the apprehension from families just based on like the historical, the history of Atlanta in certain parts. And so that's what I am seeing as two of the main drivers to help combat that. I definitely think the city and kind of moving affordability, the expansion of services, the expansion of transportation. That is one that's a tough one for, that's also a tough conversation in regards to expanding MARTA and expanding transportation. But the reality is mobility in some of our areas are key to opportunities, to jobs, to, additional, higher pay for families. And so when you live in a community where the bus only runs, once every hour, and it takes additional 30 to 45 minutes to get to the nearest train station, and you have to, with that itself has, compounded issue where people are choosing to leave. And so that's that is a lot of the decline that we're seeing in some of our schools, particularly on the south side and the west side of town. I think we also cannot dismiss the historical impact that when the city chose to eradicate all public housing, whether it was the Bourne Homes, University Home, Capitol Homes, all of those housing, and pretty much limited, was picking and choosing where to place families. That also, in fact, is some of the impact that we're seeing for our lower numbers in our schools on the south and the west side. And Richard talked about it as well, where those communities have been, are hard hit in regards to lack of education, lack of opportunity, lack of opportunity. Same thing with affordability, same thing with transportation, same thing with access to, resources, community, services in their actual communities. And so it's a holistic problem that we have in here that's just been compounded, and it's impacting our schools.
So, one final question that I have for you guys. I always try to end these conversations with a little bit of positivity. I think everyone within the sector understands how big the fight that we're fighting is, and particularly nowadays, how much bigger that fight has gotten. And for me, it's very important for us to continue to stay encouraged within this work, because this is something that we love to do and we are fighting for and wake up every morning to fight for. So the final question that I have for any of you guys to answer, or all of you guys to answer quickly, is what does encouragement for you look like during this time? Like, what is the thing or the North Star right now that's waking you up in the morning to continue to fight this massive, like, tornado of a fight that we're currently going into? I know for us, we try to stay encouraged just with loving the work that we're doing and remembering how much we love it, despite all the mess that may come our way. So I want to hear from you guys on what that encouragement looks like for you to potentially inspire some of the audience to have that same level of encouragement as well.
I can go first. I've been racking my brains about this question for 2 days ever since you first brought it to me, and it's hard because we're in a period of mourning right now. 150,000 plus Americans are dead. And schools are downwind from a broken system, and we're now kind of being asked to solve a lot of societal ills. be it childcare, social emotional learning. And so it's hard to imagine what is that, it's hard to imagine being in the middle of World War II and being told like, okay, what's the good side from this? What's happening? What can we be excited about? But in spite of that, hearing Ishay talk about structural, fundamental issues that have helped build white supremacy and maintain white supremacy, and us being able to talk about that openly, if there is one silver lining, I am so thankful that we're able to see what are the underlying cracks in the foundation. Because you don't go to the doctor unless you know you're sick. And if we are going to dismantle a type of racism and white supremacy and classism that the city's been built on, and that a lot of American cities have been built on, then first we got to know that they exist. And so I'm personally encouraged just being able to call a spade and recognize kind of where were things and how can we work together to build a society that doesn't rely on those in the future. So thank you personally, Ishay. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. You see, I was snapping in agreement, because I think that's what it is. We have these conversations all the time, and we all know what the issues are, and we all see the multi-level and multifaceted nature of these issues. And so in these dark times, and in these times where we feel that they are so big, how can we help? Every little bit that we do can help. And so I just move in the space of positivity, to know that, my charge is to continue to fight every single day, to make sure to close the achievement gap, to be a part of ensuring that our communities, and that every community has that, every child and every family and every community has that chance. And I will be open and honest with, real with you guys. I have seen that change. At one time, I actually thought like, oh, what am I doing? I don't see it. I'm actually seeing it. And so has there been years and decades of work? Absolutely. Will I stop here? No, I don't think any of us will. And so I'm just, I just want to move in a positive space of us to continue to fight in action. Not only our words, but continue to fight in action, and to know that I think this time period in everyone's lives has really not only we know of the issues, we've studied them, you guys provide the history of it, but now I truly feel that it is touching us internally, emotionally, in different ways, and all of us. And so we know what solutions are. It's not one solution, it's it's multi-level. And I stand in positivity of being able to connect with everyone, with all of you guys, with anyone that want to be on the ground with me to continue to fight to get this right for children, because they are our future. I fully believe great education is the great equalizer. Being a product of it, my family, being, my mom being a single mom, raising us, being that's my life story. And so I just stay in positivity of continuing to fight in action. And I'm excited that you guys, I'm just excited to still have partnerships, and know that there are people out there, millions of us, that want to fight for the same thing. And so let's just continue to do the work.
So
on my doing the work t-shirt.
Oh, look at that. See?
Yeah,
Word
so
hashtag is t-shirted.
I'm with you.
Let's do it. We'll do the work.
So I think it's important that we acknowledge now and continue to acknowledge that we are in the midst of a collective global trauma that we have never seen. None of us in our lifetime have seen anything like this. And the things that get us through that are the acknowledgement and the connection that we have with each other as people, shifting focus from numbers to humans. And while there's money and while there are numbers behind that, there are children and adults and communities, and that those communities mean different things to different people, and all of those things are incredibly valuable. And the greatest value that I see that APS is providing right now for our children is the routine, the connection, the connection to other children, the connection to other adults, the reminder that we are part of a larger system, and that in being part of that larger system, while we have our own little communities in Atlanta, we're the little small villages of neighborhoods that we have that are great, are part of a larger thing that we all depend on each other, and we are all deeply connected to each other. And so for me, what gives me hope is that realization that there are human beings behind test scores, behind budget numbers, behind all of these things, and that if we're supporting human beings, we are human beings, and we can support each other, and we have that ability to do that. And so I hope that what comes out of this is greater empowerment, greater sense of community, greater sense of connection, and greater ability to work across areas to really lift up our children and lift up our communities.
Well, thanks, Richard, and thanks, Steve and Shay, for joining us. There are people behind Zoom calls as well, and we thank you for being some of the people who joined us today. I know that I've learned a lot. I think hopefully folks in the Q&A have learned something as well, and those who are watching. Thank you so much for the work that each of you are doing, the important role you're playing. We definitely want to stay in touch with each of you, and hopefully folks who've been paying attention will want to get engaged as well, whether that is joining all of their PTAs all the way up the chain from their elementary school to the high school, whether that's attending the school board meetings, which are also on Zoom, so they can participate in those and participate in the facility master plan. And then Stephen, thanks for the work that y'all have been doing day in and day out, not just during the legislative cycle, but all the work around that. And he's already plugged his website, gbpi.org. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us today, for being part of the conversation. And we really look forward to figuring this thing out together. It's going to take that collective effort. This is not something that CCI could do on its own, or that any of our individual organizations could do. It's dependent upon all of us working together for the sake of for children, but also for the broader community. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and thank you everyone who is a part of this conversation, and thank you for the attendees as well. CCI is going to continue to try to fight this fight to end social and economic inequality, and during the rest of this month, we have some other programming coming up in the spirit of education, so stay tuned for some correspondence about that. We have a leadership breakfast with Ed Chang, who runs Redefined Ed, and we have some community conversations with so people that are on the ground doing this work and thinking about what the preschool to prison pipeline may look like and what those conversations are. So definitely stay tuned for some information from us to continue this conversation moving forward with different people. And you will get this presentation and you will get this video recorded as well. So stay tuned for that. And thank you so much for tuning in.